All right, so here are the key concepts from chapter 15 and our short continuation of genetics through evolution and natural selection. So I wanted to try to articulate a little elaboration on some ideas prior to our quiz next week and give you a chance to go through, get these notes at your own pace. And so when we think about life on Earth and early life on Earth, no scientist was there to actually see the changes in organisms over time directly. And so we look at evidence and draw inferences. So it's indirect observation that's involved in interpreting early life on Earth. And it also assumes an underlying assumption. And that underlying assumption is that the natural laws of chemistry and physics and biology applied back then in early life on Earth as they do now. And so it assumes that the physical laws of nature still are exactly the same as they were back then. So if that's true, then we can make clearer sense of the evidence that we do have. And when we also think of science and data collection, we have to recognize that way of thinking is actually relatively new in the human experience. Human belief systems about the world exist long before modern approaches to doing science. And science is underlined here as limited to empirical evidence of the physical observable universe. So things that we can all see firsthand and agree on, that's what science is based on, not things of the supernatural or any kind of faith-based belief system. And so when we are talking about this, make sure that you understand that my objective, my goal here as your teacher is not trying to convince you not to believe in a faith that might have different perspective on the world and life on Earth. Just know that I am trying to help you understand a scientific perspective that if you were to pursue science as a career, you would be expected to know and understand this viewpoint from a scientific perspective. And so just understand that I respect individuals' beliefs and faiths, and I know they can be vastly different from person to person. And I'm not attempting to offend anyone. I'm just trying to share with you what scientists as a whole, as a collective community, are saying about early life on Earth and how it has changed over time. And so, with all due respect, I am just passing this knowledge on and in hopes that you can understand from a scientific perspective how we make sense of things and life on Earth. So Aristotle is credited as one of the first naturalists to observe life on Earth from a scientific perspective about 2,000 years ago, observing, questioning, and understanding that there are these natural laws that underlie the physical universe. And so this underlying assumption kind of goes back to Aristotle. And when we think of science, we can maybe think of theories and principles or laws, and we've talked about hypotheses. But oftentimes people don't understand that laws, also known as principles, and theories are not exactly the same thing. And so I wanted to clarify that using the context of what we're studying right now. So a principle is an observable pattern, some phenomena that we see in nature repeated over and over, and we continually observe that pattern. And so evolution is the idea that organisms have changed over time. And the pattern in the fossil record continually reveals this pattern of change in organisms over time, going from simple to complex in the geologic record. And so from the older layers of rock, organisms are simpler. And as you get closer and closer to the present time, there's a complexity that builds and a diversity that builds in living things. And that is what we're talking about when we say that the organisms have evolved over time. It's a pattern, it's a principle that we observe in nature. And so that's what's a scientific principle or law. Kind of like the patterns and inheritance Mendel talked about. Those are genetic laws or principles that are observable over and over again. All right, theory is a possible explanation. Possible explanation for the principle. So the principle of segregation in genetics. The theory to explain that is meiosis. Genes come in pairs and they separate during meiosis. So the theory to explain, that's what a theory is, a possible explanation for a principle, a pattern in nature. And so we could talk about Mendel's principle again of segregation, and the explanation, the theory, is meiosis to explain it. In the case of natural selection or evolution, what explains or what is an explanation for how organisms could evolve over time, and the theory to explain that, credited to Charles Darwin, is natural selection. So that's a possible explanation for how evolution could occur. All right, so who is this guy? Well, you might have seen this picture in textbooks. This is Charles Darwin, but who is he? Who is he? What did he do? Well, the nutshell version, 1831, he embarked on a 5-year map-making voyage on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, and as part of that mission, Darwin was the naturalist for the ship. And he was trying to help naturalists understand the idea, what could explain how organisms evolve. So scientists were understanding through the fossil record that organisms have changed over time. How does this happen? That's what they were trying to figure out. And Darwin had that question in the back of his mind. During that 5 years, he was influenced by a book by Charles Lyell, Principle of Geology, and his own observations and notes and fossil collections during this 5 years of collecting data, making observations. And then an economist named Thomas Malthus, who had an essay about human population growth. And he correlated population growth would go up pretty quickly, grow exponentially, but then eventually would hit a threshold where there was famine, disease, and war. And he predicted this is what happens in natural wild populations. It also will eventually happen with the human population. And so understanding these ideas, principles of geology was talking about Earth's long period of change. And so an older Earth to go through all the change geologically for mountains to be raised and continental drift and all of those things. That gave Darwin the idea that if Earth is a little older than we thought, then there could have been time for things to evolve through this different way people hadn't thought about before. He was also influenced by the fact that people would breed crops and livestock for specific traits. And that was called artificial selection. You're selecting for a particular trait in an organism and trying to get more of that. And so, again, this is Charles Darwin. And how did he answer his big question? Well, his answer to how organisms could evolve was known as natural selection. So what is natural selection? It's also worth noting, who's this guy? Well, this guy is Charles Wallace, or George Wallace, excuse me. Anyway, we're going to get back to him. So how did natural selection become part of scientific thinking? The story in the textbooks credits it all to Charles Darwin, but it's more interesting than that. So Darwin, after his Beagle trip, 10 to 15 years of thinking about his idea of natural selection, having it written in journals, in his own personal journals, but not published, he gets an essay from, Alfred Wallace, the guy on the bottom here, who had been traveling and came up with this idea and wrote to Darwin for some advice. And he outlines in his article to Darwin evolution by means of natural selection. So Darwin had the idea of natural selection, hadn't published it. He gets this letter by Wallace saying, hey, what do you think of this idea of evolving by natural selection? Well, a week later, they share that idea jointly with a paper that they produce and share at a conference, even though neither were present, but they shared that information with other scientists, naturalists of the day. And then in 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which detailed the idea of natural selection with a lot of information. And so he gets credited for the idea, and Wallace is kind of left in the lurch. So that's kind of more to the story, just like with Rosalind Franklin and the discovery of DNA structure. There's always a little more to the history than we know and that the books tell us. So anyway, initially, fierce opposition to the idea of natural selection and evolution, and in part because it didn't fit prevailing beliefs and challenged a lot of faith perspectives and made people uncomfortable. But it did take some time and eventually became the major understanding in the scientific community. So what's involved in natural selection? Individuals of a population have variation in their heritable traits, so things they pass on from one generation to the next. So we have natural inherited variation. We also have populations that have more offspring than can possibly succeed and survive, and that's because there's a limit to resources. So we have finite resources, limited resources, which means there's a struggle for some in the population to make it. And it's in that struggle that those with variations in their traits that are more suited to their environment are going to survive and reproduce more. And so then that trait variation is more favored for the next generation. And so fitness is actually about survival and reproduction than it is strength or speed or stealth or any other attribute we want to say is more fit. Fitness is just a survival and reproduction measure for the next generation. And then, so traits that are favored by natural selection are considered adaptive traits, and then eventually become adaptations that we talk about, like a duck's webbed feet is an adaptation. And it's because it became an adaptive trait for swimming in water. So what do we call features, again, on organisms that help them survive in their environment? We call those, again, adaptations. It's also important to understand that organisms don't evolve, populations do. I got to stop this video and make a part 2. So I'm almost out of time, but we'll pick up here for part 2.